Management. My name is Margot and I'll be your X-Talks moderator for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes and includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved, so please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank MRN who helped develop the content for this presentation. MRN are the experts in bringing clinical trials to the patient in their community. They collaborate with the best in class when required and recruit and retain the best and most experienced talent available in their sector. MRN specializes in conducting clinical trial visits in the patient's home and supporting clinical trial sites with nursing resources. At MRN, they understand the complexities of today's clinical trial environment and the burden this places on both patients and sites. Their nursing services are designed to ease these burdens, therefore accelerating patient recruitment and retention and maximizing the impact of the trial for the pharmaceutical sponsors. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's event. A biologist by education, Paul Bodfish has spent over 25 years in the clinical research sector in a variety of roles and is an expert in understanding and overcoming the challenges associated with the regulatory and practical elements of successfully running hybrid clinical trials. Paul is one of the original founders of the Medical Research Network, and in his current role is responsible for the ongoing development of MRN's QMS, which continues to evolve as the industry moves into more decentralized trial models. Paul is also MRN's representative on the IMI Trials at Home Consortium, which is a multi-stakeholder team including academia, SMEs, private foundations, and EFPIA members, whose remit is to develop and test remote decentralized methods to streamline data collection, participant recruitment, and retention. Our next speaker is Stuart Redding. Stuart Redding has over 25 years in the clinical research sector, having worked for a number of sponsors and CROs before joining MRN. Stuart's experience spans many disciplines, including data management, clinical operations, project management, business development, proposal and budgets, and marketing. Stuart was one of the MRN founders in 2006, joining the organization of Head of Project Management. In 2009, Stuart took on the role of Vice President of Global Business Development and Marketing before stepping up as Chief Operating Officer in 2017. Stuart brings incredible insight to the running of decentralized clinical trials, having experienced the many challenges of running clinical trials in traditional models. With overall responsibility for delivering all of MRN's trial portfolio, Stuart is always focused on maximizing performance, improving process, and promoting high-quality decentralized approaches. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the mic over to our speakers. You may begin whenever you're ready.
Hi, thank you everybody. So this is Paul Bodfish. I'd like to start by thanking everybody for joining today. So we're going to start by giving you a brief background on decentralized trials, what's changing in our sector, and why we need to think about changing the way in which we operate clinical trials and how we need to think about moving them outside of the traditional trial site. Stuart will then talk about how MRN runs its and manages its own hybrid decentralized trials, how we've operationalized those trial models, and how our QMS fits into the existing framework that we've built alongside compliance with the regulations. And then finally, we'll take a look at some protocol development and technology factors that come into play when running decentralized clinical trials, and what this means from a regulatory perspective and how these might change as we move forward. So we're seeing lots of challenges in the healthcare space as well as the clinical trial space today. So the advent of social media and the internet has meant that patients have more power over their healthcare and their health data than they've ever had before. So things like Dr. Google and other search engines allow us to look at symptoms that we might have and make our own minds up about disease areas that we might be suffering from. We also have technology such as the wearables, smartphones, Fitbits, etc., that allow us to engage directly with our health status. There's better access now, either remotely or through other technology than there's ever been before with healthcare professionals. So, for instance, there are apps now that we can use on our phones that allow us to engage directly with general practitioners. Indeed, in our own company, we're able to use an app called Perkbox, which allows us within 2 or 3 hours of signing on to engage via a FaceTime-like app with a general practitioner. So this has changed the way in which we manage our own healthcare. In some countries now, there's a move towards more payment for healthcare. This, again, I think increases the sensitivity and our attentiveness towards our own healthcare and the expected outcomes. So this means our expectations as individuals are much higher, and what I think we need to start seeing is that expectation moved into clinical trials. We also have increasing pressure on sites. So sites now have less space, less resources, and less finances, and yet they're being asked to run more clinical trials in more complex disease areas and using more complex biological medicines. There's also more pressure on them in terms of regulatory oversight, and the expectations for them to comply with those regulations. From a sponsor perspective, the challenges aren't going away. So we're seeing the cost of running clinical trials increasing now. Latest figures put that at between $1.5 billion to $2 billion to get a drug to market. And trials are taking longer, with recruitment and retention pressures continuing to exert their force, such that recruitment and retention rates continue to drop. All of this is wrapped around increasing pressures from regulators who are thirsty for more robust data, and that includes having a better understanding and insight into the economic benefit of the drugs and value-based pricing. So I think where that leaves us as an industry and as a sector is that we're behind current healthcare practices in mainstream healthcare. We need to move forward with that and follow in suit with clinical trials if we're to bridge that gap as products come to market.
So before we move into talking about how we deliver decentralized trials and hybrid trials, I think it's probably worth just looking at where we are as an industry and what we're talking about when we refer to decentralized or hybrid trial models. I think traditionally, and we'll all be very familiar with this type of model, the whole clinical trial revolves around the site. So whether you're working in a pharmaceutical company or a CRO, traditional models, you would go out, you would find a number of sites, run a set of feasibility, and essentially rely on those PIs to deliver the patients into the clinical trial. And we all know that doesn't always work, and a large proportion of sites don't recruit. A large proportion of sites will only put in one patient, which is the worst scenario you can have. And you'll always get the bulk of your patients from the top 30% recruiting sites. But the recruitment timelines are never met; they always overshoot. And although I think we're a tolerant industry in accepting that not hitting targets is okay, we need to move away from that. And the need for speeding up recruitment, as Paul's just been alluding to, is what we're really chasing. And in that site model, the site has control. It's not patient-centric. The patient has to travel backwards and forwards to the site. You get a high amount of dropout and trial fatigue for the patients. And so that's a generally frustrating model, but it's the model that we quite often revert back to, because I think as an industry, we're evolving slowly, but everybody feels comfortable and knows where they are in that environment. Over time, some large pharma wanted to experiment with virtual trial models, and we know who they are. And the virtual trial model was born. A fully virtual model, in today's environment is potentially feasible. As Paul mentioned, wearables, the technology, the internet, handheld devices, everybody's becoming a lot more familiar with working remotely and handling their personal affairs, including their personal medicine from a remote location. But at the end of the day, if you're a patient and you're diagnosed with a new illness, you do want some advice. And everybody wants somebody to say, how are you? How do you feel? How are you doing? So the virtual model, where you really have the patient being recruited and enrolling online, entering data online, potentially being posted medication, and really getting no healthcare. It can work in some environments, but not in all. And I think that's where the industry is starting to land on what we would call a hybrid trial model or a community trial model, which is what we're here to talk about today. And this is patient centricity at its utmost. This is what we've been doing for the last 13 years, getting nurses to go into patients' homes and conduct the protocol-defined visits at the patient's leisure, at home or at work, to not put the burden of the clinical trial on them. So you can, in this diagram, you see you've still got the sponsor. You still have sites. You may have less sites, higher throughput sites, but they will still be there. The PIs will still have the ultimate responsibility. The site will still recruit the patients, although they may, in this day and age, use recruitment technologies to do that. They will still consent to the patient in this model, but the nurse will go out and do, somewhere between 50 and 75% of the visits, where possible, in the patient's home. So they will go quite often with the IMP, which will be delivered from a central pharmacy or a site pharmacy to the nurse as they interact, as they go to visit the patient. They will draw lab samples. They'll fill in source data. The lab samples will get couriered back to the central labs. The data goes back to the site. The source data goes back to the site. So the sites are still responsible. The PI still has oversight of the nursing. The nurses sign the delegation log. The source data goes back to the site for the site to analyze. So the PI remains under control, but everything becomes everything circles around the patient and gives the patient more control of their healthcare. So that's, I think, it's important when patients know what their choices are. So if you're going to Dr. Google with your new illness, you'll be aware of clinical trials. We've worked on some clinical trials where patients have been queuing up to get access to the study because they know it's coming through and they want to participate. Patients are a lot more educated, but they also want to be given all the benefits of modern life today, and that is having access to healthcare on the end of the phone or having a nurse come to them to be able to do the visits at their leisure. And it'll keep them in the study, ultimately. You get a lot better retention using a home nursing service than you would do with the patients traveling.
So let's move on to protocol design. So as Stuart's alluded to, we're moving to a more hybridized model. Not every trial is going to have its solution provided by a virtual model, and indeed I think there are probably very few therapeutic areas today that would benefit from that. So making sure that you have a protocol that is flexible enough to allow for both site visits and patient visits is going to be critical. But ultimately the aim of the protocol still has to be to deliver robust data. So what are the things you actually need to think about when you're designing your protocol for a decentralized trial? So you need to think about your target population. So where are they? Who are they? What is the prevalence of the disease? And how close are those patients likely to be to the sites? If you want to have regular interaction between the patient and the physician, then it makes sense to have that patient relatively close to sites. If you don't have that, we're going to have the issue that we see today where patients are going to struggle to meet the protocol, the visit demands of a protocol, and they're ultimately either not going to enroll or they're going to not be retained for the full duration of the trial. So developing a protocol that has the patient in mind is absolutely key. I've been lucky enough to speak to a number of patient advocacy groups over the last couple of years, and it's clear that if we're going to get the best out of a protocol, we should get those individuals involved. They know what it's like from the patient perspective to take part in a clinical trial. They know how onerous it can be, and they know how difficult it can be given the disease state that they're trying to manage. Anecdotally, I heard one story where a patient was virtually wheelchair bound on a multiple sclerosis trial, and yet they were asked to do a walk test. Now, this patient, to actually get out of the wheelchair, is going to be really difficult for them. So think of the number of protocol deviations you're going to have from patients just in that type of model. So these are things that we need to start thinking about more. We make them more patient friendly. Access to sites can be a challenge. Again, it's not just about the patient. It can be about their caregivers. It can be about the family that are often taking them to the site. Location is absolutely key, because for the rarer disease models that we tend to get involved in, patients are dispersed, and you'll have small numbers of sites where patients are actually likely to be able to enroll into those trials. So they could be expected to travel hundreds of miles, either just to see the physician or to give something like as basic as a blood sample. So even with IMP administration, that doesn't have to be done in the trial site. So as Stuart alluded to, those sorts of models now are relatively mainstream, in that most IMPs, providing they're safe, can be administered in a home environment by a well-trained nurse. Of course, if you are going to go down that route, you need to think about the stability of your product, and you need to think about how the chain of custody can be maintained. So from a logistical perspective, MRN have the models and the processes to make sure that we can deliver those products safely to the patient, but it's also about looking at the stability. So if you have a short stability window and you've got an infusion, chances are, if you're running that from a centralized pharmacy, that might be quite a challenge to get to patients that are 6, 7, 8 hours away. If you're following a local pharmacy route, that might be fine for disease areas that have a high prevalence, but it won't be fine for more rare or niche diseases where patients could live miles from sites. We also need to think about the types of assessments and the frequency that those assessments happen, and what tech is available to help do those. It's not always about tech actually performing the assessment itself. It can also be about making sure there is some physician interaction with the patient in their home to do some of those assessments via video links. So this is where the income of telehealth and telemedicine is starting to make a difference in clinical trials. It allows the patient to engage face-to-face via a screen with with the physician. And you can also, through some of these systems, actually input basic health data and trial data as well at the same time. Other things that we need to factor when we're building our protocol is where are we looking to run that trial. So there may well be country-specific regulations that you're not aware of that may make that difficult to run in a decentralized manner. So for instance, in some countries we know that administration of certain drug types might be forbidden outside of a clinical hospital environment. Or indeed, it may require a physician as opposed to a nurse to perform either the assessments or the administration. So it's not just the clinical research regulations that we need to be familiar with. We need to broaden our understanding and have a better view of the healthcare landscape in those countries. There may even be cultural issues to consider as well. In some countries and some cultures, it may not be polite for patients to invite other professionals into their home, and that would extend to nurses. So these are all sorts of the aspects that people need to think about when they're designing their protocol if we're going to follow a decentralized model. And indeed, if we're going to be applying technology, we need to think about the technology infrastructure in that particular country. How good's the Wi-Fi? How good's the broadband? If we're using up-to-date technology like 5G, is that going to be supported? If we're having to go through the patient's own Wi-Fi network, how's that going to work? Is that ethical, etc.? There's a lot of implications. So there are another set of factors that we need to consider when we're running decentralized trials. So GCP 4.3 will tell you that the investigator or health institution has to provide adequate medical care to the patient during their participation in the trial. So if we're running a fully virtual model, we've still got to make sure that we meet the patient's medical needs. In a hybrid model, we need to make sure that we get the right mix between in-home protocol visits versus on-site protocol visits. We need to get the balance right between the amount of non-face-to-face and face-to-face interaction between the PI and the patient. It's not just about patient safety, it's also about making sure from a sponsor perspective that your PIs are getting the right exposure to your products. So we've got to think about that balance, but ultimately we've got to make sure that it's patient-centric. We also need to think ultimately though about the regulations, and we can't move away from that. And with the latest E6R2 addendum, section 4.2.5 of GCP states that the investigator is responsible for supervising any individual to whom the investigator delegates trial-related duties. So in this particular instance, we're talking about the home care nurse. Now, home care nurses generally are not research nurses. Research nurses in most countries are hard to come by. They're a specialist niche type of nurse, and whilst they're well trained in healthcare, they're also fully versed with the clinical trial regulations. Home care nurses tend not to come from that type of background. There'll be registered nurses who want to work near their own home in the community. They are unlikely to have a regulatory background. And from that perspective, we need to make sure, as their employers, that we are giving them the right background and training and education and qualifications to ensure that they can meet the regulations. But the PI still has to provide that oversight of that individual for any tasks that he or she delegates to that nurse. So we need to have robust processes in place to make sure that that delegation is documented and that oversight is maintained. We've seen from some of the recent Q&A guidance that's come out of the EMA in particular that they are recommending that a contract is put in place between the site and the home healthcare provider. And what the expectation of that contract is that it will provide details on how the PI is going to provide oversight of the nurse. I think this is a good example of where the regulators have the best of intentions, but the methodology that they're suggesting doesn't necessarily help us and support moving to decentralized models, because what it's really doing is adding a bureaucratic or administrative layer to an already difficult workload for both the site and for organisations like MRN. Having said that, when the regulators make these stipulations, we need to make our best efforts to make sure that we are compliant. And so MRN have developed processes and documentation to make sure that that oversight is maintained. Not that it wasn't always there and isn't there in our processes today, because it is, but it's just putting it in a more formalised way so that auditors and monitors, etc., can fully demonstrate that that oversight is there and that the PI, most importantly, understands their obligations. We also, in today's world, need to consider confidentiality, and in particular, we need to think about personal data and personal health information. We know through the advent of GDPR last year across the European Union that now there's more focus than ever on patients' own data. And so with these type of decentralized models, there's undoubtedly going to be a movement of personal information and PHI from one organization to the other. So organizations like ourselves, we're going to be in receipt of that information from the sites, and then working with our partner organizations, be them third-party nursing companies, be them technology companies, we're also going to be passing that data on. So it's important that that data transfer is done in a controlled manner, and that means you need to make sure that you follow the rules laid down by the European Commission by having data processing agreements in place between the controllers and the processors. There also needs to be absolute clarity in your informed consent for the patient, so that they understand how their health information and personal data is going to be shared with such parties. You don't need to go as far as to list all those organisations out, but it needs to be clear to the patient that their data will be shared. And obviously for a nurse, we need that information. We need to know where the patient lives, otherwise we can't pitch up and perform the protocol assessments. So in North America, we have HIPAA. HIPAA stipulates that sites, if they're handing or transferring personal health information to third parties, that you have to have business associates agreements in place. Now, in our experience, not all sites have those, and so we've developed our own templates to make sure that when we are working with US sites, if they require those controls and documents, then we have those there.
Okay, thanks, Paul. So that's the theory. So how do we actually deliver to that theory and ensure that we're delivering a quality product when we're running these types of hybrid models? From the second we get a new opportunity, so when a sponsor or CRO approaches us with a protocol, we'll start looking at that critically to establish what we can't do and deliver across all aspects of the organisation. So our first review of any protocol will come from our nursing team, our in-house nursing team, and they'll be looking at what can we do in this protocol in the home. Sometimes it's stipulated, the protocol will be written, as per Paul's slide. If it's been considered as part of the protocol design, it may already say which visits can be conducted in the home. It may be that we're looking at something that's visit intent, and the customer really wants us to come up with a recommendation of what we could do and what would help. That's the first point in the review. We would also then look at the assessments within those visits and what they would take to be done. So our simple rule of thumb is if it can be done by a nurse, i.e. we don't need a physician on site, and the nurse can carry the equipment, then we can generally do it in the home. And that includes administering the IMP, as long as the IMP is proven to be safe for home administration. So again, we would look at the numbers of dosing, the safety data that's listed out in the protocol. And ideally, we'd also have an IB or a pharmacy manual at that point to review, and that would give us a view of whether we could administer that product in the home. If we're going to administer the product, or if we're taking blood samples, we need to look at the logistics. We look at whether that's going to come out of a central pharmacy, which we can set up, or out of the site pharmacies. We need to look at how we're going to do that via courier network or other method, whether we need dry ice, etc. We'll also look at whether what countries it involves. We'll look at what countries we can cover from our general coverage, and also what countries we can deliver that service in. As Paul mentioned, we can't do everything everywhere. There are regulatory restrictions and ethical restrictions around where you can and can't use nurses and may need physicians, or can't see patients in the home at all, etc. So we'll always look at that. So we'll have to go around that nursing, that project management, a contracting, and a pharmacy review on any protocol before we'll even consider putting together a proposal and a bid to run that study as a hybrid model. If all of those things come together and we're happy that that is safe and deliverable, we'll put together a budget, and obviously we'll go into that negotiation phase, but only once we've been through those quality gates. The next major step really there would be to get a project onto a verbal award. And at that point, again, we initiate the same level of review. So we would want a final protocol, we would want final IB, pharmacy brochure, any other documentation that's been created for that product or for the sites for the study in general, and it would go through a thorough review again. We quite often get involved very early in the protocol design process. A lot of our good key account customers will come to us early because they want that consultancy approach. They want us to help them design a study that will maximise the community-based visits, which will give them better delivery, better patient care. So by the time we get to that final version, quite often things have changed. Quite often the services that are required have changed. Certainly the countries and the scope have changed. So we go back around that review again before we get to a final contracting sign-off stage. So you've got a number of quality gates that we need to get through before we start to work on any project. When we get to that stage and we kick off a project, we go through a further definition stage, because we go out there and we deliver care, and we won't get down to a level of what types of needles and giving sets are you going to use in the project until we're into a contracted model. And we go into a lot of detail around the actual scope of what we need to deliver within that project, and that gets signed off again internally by all of our operating divisions as well as the customer. We'll create nursing manuals. We don't use the protocol for our nurses, as Paul said. The nurses are experts at going out and delivering care in the community. We create nursing guidelines that are very much focused on the work they have to do, along with aid memoirs and flow charts, etc., to enable them to go and perform the visits, comfortably in the patient's home. And alongside that, we develop all of the training materials that will be delivered to the individuals. And again, that is then all signed off by all divisions involved internally and the customer. Before we get to a country setup stage, we'll also be looking at ensuring we have all the final ethical and regulatory approvals in place. Although we don't do them, yourselves as the customers will need to provide us copies or evidence that you have regulatory approvals. We have final signed protocols, we have ethical approvals in place for each of the countries we're going to go to. And again, that goes through a quality gate sign off internally here, so that we know that we're working with all the correct approvals in place, showing due diligence in what we're about to go and do. Ultimately, we're going to go out and potentially give IMP to a patient. We need to know that all the T's have been crossed and the I's have dotted at that point in time. And then we'll go ahead and set up the country, and we won't sign off any country visit startup until we know that we've got all of our appropriate contracts in place as well. So there is at least 4 layers of quality gate internally through our study startup process to make sure that everything that we deliver is done to all the appropriate regulations into the quality that we define internally at MRN. When we get into a project, we predominantly work on what we would call a just-in-time training model, because ultimately we're delivering care to patients in the home and we have no idea where they're going to live. So we may know where the sites are, but the whole benefit of going with a hybrid model is the sites can recruit patients from a long distance from the site because they're not going to travel as often. We do a lot of rare disease work where the patients could live hundreds of miles away from the site in different states, in different countries sometimes. So the aim is always to identify a nurse once we've had the patients referred to us. And again, there's another gate in terms of we need a physician's order form and a subject referral form to come through from the site before we will start to put our nurses in place to go out and see that patient. The PI has to give his approval, her approval, and delegation to us to go out and see that patient. It's their responsibility to make sure the patient is suitable and fit to be seen in the home. At that point, we'll identify a nurse. Their CV will be checked and signed off against a job description defined per project, and they then go into the training process. All of our training is done online. All of our training contains competency testing. We expect all nurses to be achieving 100% pass on the competency testing before they will get signed off to see any patients in the home. And a whole training package will then be signed off by one of our nursing managers, and that will include, the subject referral form, the physician's order form, the nurse's CV, a copy of their training log, a copy of their CV, the competency testing, and the delegation log that they will need to sign for the PI to countersign, so that we have a GCP link to the site. Only at that point will a nurse be allowed to go out and do a visit, and on early visits they will also, in complex studies, have accompanied visits with nurse managers or local country lead nurses to ensure they know and can complete the visits accurately. And when we certainly for the first 4 visits per individual nurse, our nurse managers will perform a thorough QC check of all of the data that comes through on their source documentation. And for all subsequent visits, we'll gap check all of the documentation. So all of that source that comes out of our visits that goes into the site has been checked for accuracy. As we get into the study, the nursing QC is ongoing, as we said. We also have independent internal QC and audit groups. So study QC happens on a regular basis where we'll look at how we're conducting the studies internally. We will also use our independent auditors to come in and look at our projects and obviously our processes. We welcome customer audits pre and during studies. I think we're very proud of our quality management system and the SOPs and everything that we have in place. We welcome people coming in and looking at those. We track our issues. We have a technology platform to log all issues, which allows us to categorize and trend report on issues that come up in projects, be they minor or clinical in nature, and they get reviewed both by our quality group and at the senior management level. We look at our status reporting, we look at KPIs, we look at the delivery of all projects against targets. We share those KPIs with customers, be that on a project level or a portfolio level. For all of our key account customers, we'll run regular governance sessions with a member of the senior exec team allocated to each of those, where we can look at the reporting and the performance that we're delivering on all of our portfolios. I mentioned the trends. We also go out and get feedback from the sites. We'll also welcome feedback from the customers. And all of these things allow our project management group to ensure that we're navigating the journey, delivering the studies on track. Not necessarily dissimilar to running a standard model, but obviously we're facing different types of issues, different types of challenges because we're out there delivering patient care in the home environment. Anything that comes out of all of those individual studies, portfolios, the trends will get fed into our continuous improvement processes. And when we talk about continuous improvement at MRN, it's not something that happens in the periphery. We have a VP and a director on staff that focus solely on continuous improvement activity, and all of our cross-functional continuous improvement projects are run essentially from the board at a strategy level. So we'll be looking at issues, the trends and issues that come out of the reporting, the KPIs, as I mentioned, the feedback that we're getting, Where we're seeing operational delivery struggle, or where we're seeing challenges, we will look at those. We will look at changing regulations and a changing trial environment. We'll look at governance in terms of both our internal and our customer governance and our structures. You know, as a growing organisation, we are evolving and we are changing, and all of those things need to be managed. And the continuous improvement process that we run internally takes all of those elements, it packages it around a core team of Lean Sigma trained individuals who can deliver these projects with good measurable outcomes and associate rollout and training.
So let's move over to technology and innovation and start thinking about how this is impacting clinical trials today, what it might be doing in the future, and what that means for the regulations and quality management systems. So at MRN, as Stuart mentioned, we've been using technology for various aspects today of our operation delivery. So we have MRN Tech, which is our online nurse training portal. So every single nurse that performs a home visit for MRN has to be trained before they can go out and do that, and we can perform that training on both the protocol, equipment that's being used, the GCP and good documentation practice elements, data privacy, etc. All of this is done through the online portal in local language, and the nurse has to complete that training before they can go through the quality gate to actually perform a visit. We manage the visits through another piece of technology. So we have our own in-house scheduling, management and reporting tool, and this allows us to, at the point of patient referral, know at what points we need to see that patient throughout that visit window and throughout their participation in the trial. Our nurses can also see that schedule, which allows them to fit that into their diary and their workload, and ultimately allows us to track when the home visits are completed. And finally, it allows us to see a snapshot of the data that's been captured by the nurses before it goes back to site. So from a quality perspective, that gives us a moment in time where we can do basic quality checks on the data to ensure that the right quality is going back to the site, which will reduce the amount of oversight and change that they need to spend time on. We also have an internal knowledge and learning management platform. This ensures that all of our internal staff, and by internal staff I'm referring not to the nurses, but to all of the support staff. These are our nurse managers, our project managers, our vendor management team. All of these individuals have to be trained, and this means that they're not just receiving training at a study specific level, but they're also receiving training on the regulations and how they impact on our processes, and then the processes that we're following ourselves. So this allows us to track where our staff are at any moment in time with regards to their training and what their compliance is like, and then our line managers can follow up and make sure that they're working in line with our expectations. Of course, what we're really interested in here is other innovations and technologies, and today we partner with organisations that allow us to use that technology in the home environment. So this means that we're able to start moving away from a paper-based source data collection environment to an e-source and telemedicine environment where data is collected electronically and pushed directly through either other systems or directly into the clinical database. We've had limited exposure to that today, but we're starting to see more and more of that coming through, and I think as the technology changes and becomes more widespread, that's something that we'll be seeing more of. We also pride ourselves on our quality management systems, and a large component of that is an issue management tool. So we're able to manage our CAPAs, protocol and process deviations, and continuous improvement activities through a central platform that's all overseen by our quality management team. What all of this technology allows us to do is have control. So we know where we are at any point in time with that trial, we know where issues of potential are with data, and what that allows us to do is think about what changes we might need to make moving forward to future trials, or even need that trial to make sure we get the right outcomes for patients and sponsors. So how is innovation and technology changing today? So we're seeing an absolute avalanche of new technology coming through. So today we now have electronic medical records or electronic health records that are available in health institutions. and we would love to be in an environment where we could tap directly into those. That's quite challenging because the systems, whilst they can be used to integrate real-time electronic health information from devices and even from other healthcare providers, within each country those systems can be very different, and even from hospital to hospital. So there are organisations that are working on centralising those platforms within countries, and I think really what the trials industry wants to see is a centralised platform that can be utilised. We have e-consenting tools today, so they don't just follow the paper process and automate that. What they actually do is utilise patient engagement tools. These can be in the forms of audio-visual aids to inform and educate the patient and make sure that actually the confirmation that the patient understands what they're agreeing to by participating and consenting into the trial is done in a very managed and controlled and careful way. We also have eco and e-source solutions, as I mentioned. We have telehealth solutions now that are platforms that allow basic health data to be transferred, but also to allow the patient and the physician to interact via video links. And we can do those with or without nurses. So nurses can be in the home while the patients are connecting with the PI. We also have patient companion apps. These aren't just about reminding the patient that they need to do something. They can also be used to capture basic cognitive or even other assessment informations. So perhaps if you've got rating scales, pain scales, cognitive scales, etc., these can all be done now through patient companion apps. They can be done through iPads or watches or smartphones, and these can be downloaded directly onto the phone, and then the data pushed directly through real time back to a centralized data lake. Wearables and sensors. So today, again, we have our smartphones, we have Fitbit type watches, etc., that are measuring various things like heart rate and blood pressure, etc. And all of this information doesn't need to go through Wi-Fi technology. If the right network infrastructure is there, they can go directly into a central database. Ultimately, we'll see more of this as 5G and the Internet of Things comes into operation. I think the great thing about something like 5G is that it will provide higher mobile data throughput and won't need wireless connectivity to patients' routers or other Wi-Fi networks. So it keeps the data completely secure and is thousands of times quicker than current 4G technology. So this will allow objects to connect to other databases and objects and push data through at a really quick rate, which allows us to make, as trialists, real-time decisions on the patient's health. So the benefits of technology adoption should be clear, I think, to everybody, and ultimately the result is that we have better connected health applications, but what we also have is higher quality, more robust and accurate data. And as I mentioned earlier, this also gives us sites, physicians, sponsors, it gives us real or near real-time access to data to allow us to make those decisions. So actually when it comes down to making a call on patient safety, or we want to look at the efficacy of a particular product, we've got early access to that information. Some of the technology such as EHR and EMR will also reduce transcription errors. It takes some of that human element out. Ultimately, we need to make sure that all of these advances, though, ensure that we get high quality, robust data, which means that the healthcare apps that we're seeing have to move into the clinical trial environment. So I'm going to talk very, very briefly about some of the regulations today. If we're using technology and tools, it's really important that we use validated systems. Now, everybody working in clinical trials knows that. And this slide is not designed to give you chapter and verse all the regulations are there. This is really just a snapshot. What this is trying to get across to you is that what we really need today is a clear and consistent framework for technology systems that adopts a risk-based approach. So this means that we need to look at the type of data capture that we're doing with these systems, what type of data it's capturing. Is it direct data entry versus third-party transfer? And that will allow us to through a risk-based framework, decide what level of validation that we need to do. And that's particularly important if we're outsourcing that work to third-party providers, because again, going back to GCP, what GCP is telling us is that we have to make sure that we've got oversight of those third-party organisations. So even if we're not developing software and technology ourselves, and MRN don't do that, what we need to make sure is that for companies that are doing that on our behalf, we still have the ability to validate that technology, user acceptance, test it, and make sure ultimately that it's fit for purpose and matching back to the user requirements. What we're really seeing at the moment is that the regulations are somewhat lagging behind where reality sits. So if you look at the regulations as they sit today, the EMA are generally supportive of a move towards e-source, but their latest documentation around that, which was, I think it was a theoretical document that was developed back in 2010, is nearly 10 years old. And although we're looking to receive an update of that soon, we don't know when that's going to arrive. The FDA are slightly further ahead. They have produced guidance for industry on electronic source data and clinical investigations. That dates back to September 2013. And in 2016, they gave us some Q&A on e-consent, but the EMA, again, have actually published no guidance on e-consenting. So there are regulations at a European level that sit around how we manage health data, and there's even regulations on telehealth. But what we need is a framework that brings those regulations for those types of technologies into the clinical trial environment. So this is something that the Innovative Medicines Initiative project that was alluded to at the beginning of this presentation is trying to achieve. So this is a 5-year program that's a collaboration between industry, academia and commercial organisations like MRN, and the idea is to explore the decentralised trial environment, start looking at the benefits that that can bring and how we'll actually achieve those benefits. So that's looking at best practice to date. It's looking at the type of technology environment that's out there and what are the current regulatory frameworks that sit around that. And ultimately, we want to develop and test through pilot studies, remote methods, and come up with best practice processes that can be ratified and supported by legislation. So part of the project is to involve regulators and actually look to change and modify their behaviour so that ultimately we reach our endpoints. So that takes us to the end of the presentation today. The key message I think, Stuart, and I want you to take away is that technology is here to stay in a healthcare environment, and it's going to continue to develop and evolve at pace. And that will happen irrespective of what happens in clinical trials. So we need to recognise where technology can add benefit, and most importantly, how we then operationalise that technology and ensure that we bring and lobby the regulators to align their regulations around how we use that. That's not going to happen overnight, but what you can be assured of in the meantime is that MRN continues to develop our own processes and systems, both through our internal experts, through our partner networks, to push more clinical trials into the community and to continue to support decentralized models. And in parallel with that, our QMS will continue to evolve, and as the prevalence increases, you can be sure that certainly patients will be in good hands and their safety will be at the forefront of our minds. I would just like to say finally that Stuart and I could probably talk for a lot longer and in a lot more detail about each of the aspects that we've gone into today. So I hope this has given you a flavour of where the industry is going and where we sit today and the sorts of problems and challenges that we need to overcome. If there have been questions, we'll try and go through some of those now. And if there are questions afterwards, then we'll make sure that there's opportunity for you to engage with Stuart and myself to ask those.
Yes, well, thank you very much for that insightful presentation. Now, I would like to invite our audience to continue sending in their questions or comments using the question window for the Q&A portion of this webinar, and we already have a bunch, so let's get started. Our first audience member asks, what was the main driver behind you setting up the virtual/hybrid model?
So I think for MRN, we've always been about, as an organisation, improving retention and recruitment in clinical trials. And that's really where we started. So I think that was probably our original driving force. What we're seeing, I think, is that the industry it has a better understanding today that trials need to be more patient-centric, and that's really what's driving our adoption of technology and community-based models. That has to be supported by, at one end of the spectrum, the virtual model, and what we believe firmly today is the hybrid model. We don't think the industry is quite yet ready for fully virtual models, and as we said earlier, if you want to maintain patient safety, you really need to think about the level of interaction you have between the PI and the patient. So the hybrid model, we believe, is the right thing, certainly for today and probably the next 5 years.
Yeah, I think all I would add to that is as an industry, we sit and we talk about traditional models and virtual models and hybrid models, but I think what we really need to think about is the patient-centricity element, and viewing the patients as people. And actually, if you sit and think about yourself, if you were to be offered a clinical trial or diagnosed with a new illness, what level of treatment would you want? And I think in some scenarios, going to a site and seeing a physician and having the remoteness of those assessments away from your home environment and family, etc., can be quite appealing. And in other scenarios, the convenience of having a nurse see you at home would be great. And in other scenarios, filling in questionnaire on an iPad would be sufficient. So I think we have to, as an industry, look at what options, consulting with the patient advocacy groups, as Paul mentioned earlier, what options and choices can we give the patient to make it work best for them? Because ultimately they will make their own decision. They will vote with their feet on clinical trials they don't want to participate in. And I think if you just consider generally, life, whether you get your groceries delivered online or whether you order your cabs through an app or whatever, you choose how you want to do that. But what you do as an individual may not be what your spouse or your family or your friends want to do. So it's always going to be down to individual patient choice.
Well, thank you very much for that answer. Our next attendee asks, what is your biggest risk to quality / how have you tried to mitigate this?
Gosh, that's quite an interesting question, a difficult one to answer. Sorry. I think probably for us it's about ensuring the quality of the source data. That's, I think, easier to achieve when we're moving to an electronic environment, because you can put the same controls that you have in an EDC system into an eSource tool, and that limits the amount and type of data that nurses can add. And as I mentioned earlier, for us, and this is true across the sector, nurses typically that are seeing patients in the home environment are specialists at that, and what they're not is specialists in GCP and good documentation practice. So our job is to make sure that they understand their requirements with regards to GDP and their requirements to GCP. So we do that through the training. But Stuart will have talked earlier about some of the processes that we do have, that if we are working with a paper source document, how we have process set up to review the quality of that data. So that's probably, I think, the biggest challenge for us that we've seen today, one of the biggest risks. And I say the way that we mitigated that is to have review processes and robust training. Ultimately, drugs fail or pass, based on the quality of the data. So it's our job to make sure that source data in particular is a very high and robust quality.
Thank you. Our next audience member asks, what do your patients say about the model you have presented? Do you have any feedback on how they perceive the hybrid model? Can you share some highlights, the good, the bad, and the ugly?
We do get patient feedback. We don't particularly poll it directly. I think we get patient feedback when the nurses are either with the patients, or alternatively, if they're not happy about something, that feedback will go to the site. What are the sorts of things we have? I mean, generally the feedback is very positive, and that's supported by the fact that we don't have to change nurses with patients, or patients don't go back from having their visits performed in the home to having them performed in the site. I suppose the thoughts of things that can go wrong, nurses are carrying equipment with them, so they've got a lot of portable equipment. It can be things, centrifuges, infusion pumps, all sorts of stuff, and we could have situations where there is, perhaps damage to a patient's property, whereas they're bringing that equipment in, it could bang a wall or chip paint or something. And these are very, although they're non-healthcare related things, they are still an issue for the patient. So that's something that we have seen. But typically for us, I think patients embrace the model because it allows them some flexibility about how and when they choose that visit. Of course, they have to consider the protocol window, but typically, unless we're capturing PK samples, the timing during the day when you perform those visits is really up to the patient, and we try and work it so that the nurse fits in around that. So we generally get very positive feedback.
I would probably add to that, and I agree that patients like home care. Patients stay in studies with visits in the home. If they choose to take it on, unless they get ill or something else doesn't work, they tend to stay. It doesn't work for everybody. I think it has to be said. I'll go back to my patient-centric comment. I know I'm repeating myself, but we've certainly had a couple of examples where a patient will accept to go into a home care service, and the first visit happens. They then realise that once we take the blood draw, we do have to process the blood and centrifuge it and fill in the source document, and that takes a little bit of time after the actual blood draw, and that is different to what they experience in the site, and so the visit can sometimes be longer than they anticipate, and we have had patients say, well, actually, if I have to wait while you do this, I could go to the site because I work near the site. So there are scenarios where it doesn't work for individuals, but I have to say it's always down to the individual's choice. And personally, I would. There are some scenarios where I would personally accept a visit in the home, and there are some scenarios where I would rather not. And I think that's the same for everybody.
Our next audience member asks, do the technologies collecting patient data remotely use high levels of encryption?
Yes, so certainly the ones that we have experience do. The tools that we've used internally, typically as a minimum, are encrypting to 128-bit or even 256-bit encryption. I think it depends on the type of data, but in my experience, yes, they do.
Thank you. Our next audience question is, do you do oversight visits of the home health nurses to ensure quality?
I'll take that one. Yes is a simple answer, but only when we're doing particularly complex either IMP administrations or blood draws in the home. If it's a fairly basic administration or blood sampling, as long as the nurse has the right qualifications, training, has gone through our training, got the 100% pass on the competency, and had a follow-up call with one of our nurse managers, which includes demonstrating the ability to use equipment, then we wouldn't do the visit. If it's multiple blood draws with multiple spins or long administration or reconstitution of complex IMP, quite often we'll have a nurse manager go out for the first visit to ensure that the nurse knows what they're doing. And thereafter, our QC process is focused on looking at the data. And the nurses obviously can pick up the phone at any point that they need the support. We always have a nurse manager or country lead on call to give advice and support. And I think as we move into the e-source environment, we'll be able to do additional amounts of those kind of QC checks and supporting through the e-source platform with the use of video conferencing, etc.
And I would just add to that actually when we identify nurses for a particular project, we've already laid down a specific criteria of experience and competence. So our internal nurse managers are not just looking at nurse CVs before they push them through the study-specific training. They're also looking for demonstrable skills in the competencies related to the clinical activities that they need to perform. So they have to have demonstrable clinical experience before we'll even consider running them through the training.
Thank you. Well, it looks like we're tight for time, so I'll ask one last audience question. Have you had any regulatory feedback or any inspections on the service you are providing?
Yes. So we've had 2 regulatory inspections to date. They've both been very positive, and what we've seen, certainly with the first one, which was actually nearly 10 years ago now by the MHRA, they were absolutely fine with the way that we document the oversight of the PI. That was quite critical for us because at that point in our company's development, this was still a relatively new concept within the sector. So, and of course, things have moved on since then. So we've seen that the regulators are generally very positive to the service and the way that we document it. But of course, as I also mentioned earlier, I think the regulators can sometimes go a little overboard in the way that they expect you to document things. So we have to be innovative sometimes in the way that we interpret the regulations to make sure that we don't add too much bureaucracy and administration into the process. But it's a very fine balance. But generally, we're seeing that our service is very well reacted to by regulators.
Well, thank you very much for those answers. We've reached the end of the question and answer portion of this webinar. If you have further questions, please feel free to direct them to the email address now showing on your screen. Thank you everyone for participating in today's conference. You'll be receiving a follow-up email from Xtalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. And please feel free to share the recorded version of this webinar with your friends and colleagues using the link now showing in your chat box. A survey window will be popping up on your screen, and your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve our webinars. Now, please join me in thanking our speakers, Paul Bodfish and Stuart Redding. We hope you found this conference informative, and have a great day, everyone.